the world is changing around us, and the figure that we start with in the book is that in 1999, the West is producing and consuming 80% of global GDP. 3/4 of everything is being consumed in the West. And that's an extraordinary level of economic domination. That's down to about 60%, and most of that happening in the crash of 2008, but then slowly moving down subsequently. But we've gone from 80 to 60%, but that's not because the total size of the world economy has shrunk, or even that Western economies have shrunk by on that scale. It's because the economies of the rest of the planet have grown so much and are continuing to grow. So that's the fundamental message. It's a bit like the one about the Roman Empire. The empires do not have their fates totally in their hands. You can't necessarily expect them to go on forever. There may not be something that allows you to continue the same level of global domination that you've exercised over a previous era, because the context in which you're now operating has changed so much. And that's the fundamental narrative that drew John and myself together. I thought I saw it in the Roman world. I thought I saw it already in the modern world, looking at it as a pretty well-informed but not expert on the modern world. It seemed to me those patterns were very clear, but he's an expert in the developing world, in modern political. He's a political economist with a specialism in the developing world. So he was interested in the non-Western world and has lived and worked there all his life. But we got into a conversation, and we both felt that this is the big story, and Western politicians go around talking as though it's entirely in their hands, and elect me and I can reverse this and whatever, and everything will be fantastic if you elect me. We can make America great again. You can't make America great like it was in the 1950s, because the level of economic power that it had in the 1950s can never be replicated. It belonged to a particular moment. Most of the rest of the West had been flattened by World War II, and the developing world hadn't developed yet. So America is globally dominant in an extraordinary way in the 1950s and on into the 1960s. But it belongs to that time. And you won't begin to make sensible choices about how to proceed from where we are now unless you really see that, unless you stop pretending that something that belonged to a particular moment could magically be recreated in a totally changed global context.
So in this case, if we acknowledge this pill that it's quite hard to swallow, what is the best course of action in the West? Since the fate is not entirely in our hands anymore, what can we do to kind of ease the pain?
There are various things that you can do to maximize your position going forward, and that probably need to be done. I mean, one is, obviously, it would change the nature of the relations that you develop with the world around you. And John and I both think, for instance, that there are an awful lot of countries that have emerged to statehood out of colonial pasts, and who share considerable values with Western countries. And in saying what we're saying, we both think that there is certain structures that develop within the Western world that make life better for most people. And we think particularly of relatively free presses, particularly of rule of law. I teach a lot of students now who come from different autocratic societies of one kind or another, Eastern Bloc, Chinese, whatever. And they do say when they come to Britain, they can't believe how relaxed everyone is. And the reason that people...
Relaxed in what way? In daily life?
Yes, in daily life. And it's simply,
right.
You can't just be screwed over in Britain or any other Western country because the person next door to you has got connections into the party. Whereas you can, everything is so much more fragile in autocratic societies because if you've got a chain of connection that allows you can just pull the rug out from someone. The rule of law is far from
Well,
perfect.
I'm from Eastern Europe, so I think it's a bit of a different story. Although I don't want to make it seem too bad because I'm from Slovenia.
Sure.
But still, I think, maybe it's also because it's a small country. So people know each other, and these circles of power are kind of incestuous, and everybody knows each other, and there's a lot of corruption and nepotism.
It takes a long time actually this is the kind of problem in the 1990s where people were swanning around patronizing, people from the West were patronizing the rest of the world and saying, why don't you just be like us? Whatever. It was 200 years of fighting within Western societies after the Industrial Revolution that actually created a rule of law which protects most people reasonably well. Rich people still have an advantage, but it's not an overwhelming advantage. That's where you're trying to get to. You'll never invent a system where it isn't worthwhile being rich, but you want it so that the advantage of being rich is limited, that you can't just do what the hell you want. That's
Well, I wonder if even in the West we are kind of leaving this point. These ultra billionaires are now owning digital platforms that we're all using, sort of like public spaces. I heard this ex Greek finance minister saying that we've left the realm of capitalism and are now living in technofeudalism. I think he wrote a book about it.
yeah, no, sure.
So,
uh, I certainly think the challenges are there. The challenges are
yeah,
deeply there, and again, recognizing them is very important. You'll not get anywhere towards limiting them if you don't realize that is a problem. That's why huge inequality, is such a problem because
right.
it gives so much advantage to the very wealthy, uh, not least by having a very vulnerable larger group of people who will having to do anything to survive, so they will respond to what rich people want. No, I think thinking a bit harder about what democracy means. So you were asking me about parallels. So the first parallel is very much the development of the developing world and changing that strategic context. But it does have the knock-on effect then of creating challenges and problems within Western society because expectations about continued growth of wealth within the West are unrealistic. And therefore, that then creates tensions and stresses because people expect, to carry on becoming richer. My children's generation is the first one that probably won't be richer than their parents.
Yep.
So how are we going to respond to that? Are we going to accept that in a kind of sensible way, or is that going to lead people to vote for people who seem to offer easy answers? They're actually rubbish, but uh, that offer a kind of false hope that somehow the fundamental change in the global patterns of economic organization can somehow be overturned by voting for this particular person in Britain. Well, really,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you can see that the challenges are
Right.
seriously there. Challenges are very seriously there.
Professor, is it always necessary that when the periphery rises, that an empire must fall and the periphery sort of takes over? I'm thinking about the so-called polycentric world order people keep talking about lately all the time. So we have the West, which is not as strong as it used to be. We also have China. We have India, as you mentioned. We have Africa, African states, and they're all kind of sort of equally strong, maybe keeping an eye on each other. It's maybe an uneasy equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium nevertheless. Is that possible?
I think that is possible, and I alternate between being optimistic and pessimistic. As I think any sensible person would.
As I was saying it, I realized it's too optimistic. You're right.
No, well, I'm not sure it is necessarily, in the sense that if we can get past our colonial heritages in the West and accept the fact that, everybody else has a right to be wealthy too, and we have no particular right to be massively more wealthy than everybody else. And in fact, a lot of our extra edge in terms of wealth came from some very dodgy lines of economic development, which had a lot to do with slavery, and that story has still got a lot of mileage to run yet. If we can get past that, then it is possible to build coalitions and alliances, and there won't just be one of them. But we do actually need that to happen, because there are some big things that are much bigger than rise and fall of the West or whatever to be dealt with.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing and following Smart Cookies on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to go on and become my benefactor on Patreon. So I'll be able to keep having these awesome conversations with really, really smart folks. Which brings me to my existing patrons, in effect producers of this podcast, a set of absolute legends without whom Smart Cookies would not exist in the first place. My immense gratitude goes to Micha Medved, Medinho, Gordan, Lorenzo, Mila, Veronica, Teja, Jurechuk, Goran, and Carmen. Your support means everything, so thank you.